Parents sent me away to live with my uncle and never saw them again, while my uncle helped me succeed. Now I own a house, a business. And finally told my bio daddy failed as a father. Back when I was just a teenager, my family experienced a devastating loss when my dad, who at the time was a successful businessman, started facing enormous financial troubles in his business. At one point, his business partner even ran away with some of the company's funds, making it impossible for my dad to keep the business afloat any longer. In the end, he was forced to shut down the business completely. Now my father had always been a very proud man, and had immense pride in his business. However, when he suddenly lost his only source of income, it made him absolutely depressed. He had always been a pillar of strength for our family, the one we all looked up to, not just for his hard work and dedication, but for the way he carried himself with dignity and grace in everything he did. His business wasn't just a source of income, it was a reflection of his dreams, his aspirations, and all the years of effort he had invested. When it crumbled, it felt like more than just a financial loss. It was as if a part of him had been taken away. For our family, this loss was not just about the money or the business itself, it was about the uncertainty that followed. Watching my father transform from the cheerful, happy man I had always known into someone who was short-tempered and constantly agitated was one of the most painful experiences of my life. It was as if the weight of his loss had drained him of the very qualities that had defined him for so long. I vividly remember those dark days, when he would spend entire days in bed, a stark contrast to the energetic man he used to be. He would only come out to eat, and even then it was a quick, almost mechanical routine, before he retreated back to the solitude of his bed. He seemed to have lost all interest in life outside of his room. My mom would try her best to lift his spirits. She would gently urge him to get out of bed, suggesting that he find some hobbies, or even just go for a walk to clear his mind. She hoped that maybe a distraction could help pull him out of the deep sadness he was sinking into. But instead of the hopeless response she was looking for, my dad would often snap at her, telling her to leave him alone. The frustration and pain in his voice were palpable, and it was clear that he was grappling with emotions he didn't know how to handle. During this difficult time, my mom became the sole provider for our family. She was a nurse at a local hospital, and while she had always been committed to her work, the financial strain of my dad's business collapse meant she had to take on even more. The bills were piling up and the rent was overdue. There was no choice, she had to pick up extra shifts at the hospital, often working long hours just to keep us afloat. It was hard to see her stretch herself so thin, juggling the demands of her job, while also trying to hold our family together emotionally. She never complained, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, and the weight on her shoulders. She was carrying so much and I admired her strength, even as I worried about how long she could keep it up. The atmosphere at home during that time was always heavy and thick, with an unspoken tension that lingered in every corner of the house. My younger brother Michael and I did our best to avoid anything that might anger our parents, especially our dad, whose mood had become so unpredictable. Now Michael was always the smarter one between the two of us, the kind of kid who was naturally gifted when it came to academics. He was a bit of a nerd, the type who loved burying his nose in books and solving complex problems for fun. In contrast, while I did well in school, my interest extended beyond just studying. I was passionate about basketball and had a few other hobbies that I enjoyed, which meant my grades weren't quite on Michael's level. But I always did my best, and up until that point, my mom had never had any issues with it, since she regularly kept track of my grades. She understood that we were different, and she valued the effort we each put into our pursuits. However, as my dad began spending more and more time at home, the dynamics in our family began to change. He suddenly had a newfound interest in our grades, and would make comments about how I clearly wasn't working as hard as Michael, pointing out the differences in our academic achievements. I remember him saying things like, "If you're not going to be the best, then what's the point of even studying? Stop going to school." His words hurt a lot. Not just because they were mean, but because they clearly came from his own pain and failure. After the loss of his business, it was as if he was projecting his feelings of inadequacy and loss onto me. It hurt to see him so disillusioned, and to feel like I was somehow contributing to his unhappiness. Even though I knew deep down that wasn't the case, I tried to focus on my studies more, hoping to impress my dad, but it was just never enough. If my mom ever showed any appreciation for my grades, my dad would quickly undermine it with taunts, insisting that there was nothing to be proud of, when the grades could be much better. At first my mom would try to defend me, reminding him that I was doing my best and that every achievement, no matter how small, deserved recognition. But as time went on, and as my dad's taunts grew more frequent and intense, something changed slowly. She started to join in with him, echoing his comparisons between me and Michael. They both began to tell me almost daily how much better my younger brother was doing than me, and how I needed to step it up if I wanted to keep up with him in life. My dad would remind me almost every day how I was always lesser than Michael. The comparisons felt relentless, and they started to seep into every aspect of my life. Eventually, they even banned me from any after-school activities, including playing basketball. They told me that if I wanted to do better in school, I needed to concentrate solely on my studies. So, I was forced to give up the sport I loved. The one thing that allowed me to feel free and happy, and devote all my time to schoolwork, just so I could be as brilliant as my brother. However, as my parents' restrictions tightened, I began to feel trapped in my own home. I was constantly on edge, waiting for their next criticism or comparison. I started to feel depressed, overwhelmed by the sense that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. There was no time for rest or relaxation. It was just a continuous cycle of studying, worrying, and trying to avoid confrontation. My dad would check up on me constantly, making sure I was studying, even if I had already finished all my assignments. He would make me feel guilty if I even took a short break. The pressure was suffocating, and it made it hard to focus on anything, let alone enjoy the things I used to love. I became so jittery around my parents that I started recognizing them by the sound of their footsteps. If I heard my dad coming up to my room, I would immediately scramble to cover my comic book with a textbook, pretending to be studying, even when I had nothing left to study. I was terrified of being caught wasting time, and afraid that he would accuse me of being lazy or not taking my studies seriously. The constant fear of disappointing them, of being compared unfavorably to Michael, consumed me. This fear and anxiety bled into every part of my life. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next criticism would come, or what I would be accused of next. I began to lose interest in everything, even the subjects I used to enjoy, because they were now just another source of stress. The joy I once found in learning and in playing basketball was gone, replaced by a deep sense of inadequacy and guilt. I became a shadow of who I once was, constantly striving for an approval that seemed more and more unattainable. And even though I was doing everything they asked, studying harder, giving up my hobbies, and trying to be the perfect student, I never felt like it was enough. The more I tried to meet their standards, the more distant and disconnected I felt from them and from myself. A year into my dad's business going under, our family was still caught in a downward spiral. My dad hadn't been able to find a new job, and my mom was working herself to the bone, trying to keep everything together while the bills kept piling up. That's when I remembered my grandmother had come to visit. I think she must have noticed right away how different our lives had become. We had once lived comfortably with everything we needed and more. But now it felt like we were just scraping by, struggling to make it through each day. I didn't know it at the time, but I think my grandmother had a serious talk with my parents about our situation. She must have seen the toll it was taking on all of us, especially on my mom, who was working endless hours, and on my dad, who was still grappling with the loss of his business and his sense of self-worth. The very next day after my grandmother's visit, my parents sat me down for a talk. I could tell right away that something was different. There was a seriousness in their expressions that made my stomach drop. They told me that they had been talking and had come to a difficult realization. They were struggling too much to take care of both me and my brother. I was taken aback, not fully understanding what they were trying to say. I asked them what they meant, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad looked at me, with a heaviness in his eyes that I had never seen before, and he explained that my grandmother had suggested a solution, one that neither of them wanted to consider, and that felt they had to. She had pointed out that my uncle, who didn't have any children of his own, had always wanted to be a father. He and his wife had a stable life, and they would be happy to look after one of us, to ease the burden on my parents, and give one of us a better chance at stability. I looked confused as I heard this. My mom then chimed in, her voice trembling as she spoke. She told me that because Michael was the youngest and more academically inclined, they believed it was best for him to stay with them, so that his education wouldn't be disrupted. They said they wanted me to go and live with my uncle, where I could have a fresh start, and they could focus on taking care of Michael. Hearing this, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I was shocked and hurt. It felt like a rejection. Like they were choosing Michael over me, deciding that he more worthy of their care and attention, just because he was more talented than me. I couldn't understand why they would send me away. Why they thought it was okay to separate our family like this. I had always done my best despite everything that had happened, and now it seemed like none of that mattered. I started to cry and asked them if they didn't love me anymore, and how I would work harder on getting better grades. But my dad shook his head and told me that they just didn't have the money to support 2 kids, and assured me that I was a better match for my uncle's family anyways. My mom tried to explain how, as the oldest child, I should make this sacrifice without complaining, since Michael had a better shot of becoming someone extraordinary. I remember staring at them, trying to process what they were saying. At that moment I felt a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I knew things had been hard, but I never imagined it would come to this, that my parents would decide to send me away. It was as if the last bit of stability I'd left was being taken away from me, and I didn't know how to cope with that. My parents were clearly torn also, and I could see that this decision wasn't easy for them. But it didn't make it hurt any less. In the end, I had no choice but to pack my bags and move to my uncle's place. When he came to pick me up the day he arrived, the reality of the situation finally sank in, and the weight of what was happening became almost unbearable. I remember crying a lot when it was time to say goodbye to my brother. Even though I knew I would still see him at school, the thought of not being together at home, of not sharing the same space, was heartbreaking. Michael was devastated too. He couldn't understand why our parents were doing this, why they were separating us when we had already been through so much together. I kept hoping that this was all just a bad dream, that I would wake up and things would go back to the way they were. But unfortunately, there was no waking up from it. My parents did hug me before sending me off, and while I could feel the sadness and regret in their embrace, it didn't ease the hurt. I knew they were struggling, and that they thought they were making the best decision for everyone. But that knowledge didn't make the goodbye any easier. When I arrived at my uncle's place, it felt both familiar and strangely foreign at the same time. I was comfortable around my uncle and his wife. They had always been kind and welcoming, and I had spent considerable time with him over the years. But this time things were different. This wasn't just a visit, this was supposed to be my new home. I couldn't help but wonder how many years I would be living here, away from my parents and brother, away from the life I had known. My uncle and his wife did their best to make me feel welcome. They were kind and tried to make the transition as smooth as possible. The first few nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed by the unfamiliarity of my surroundings. I missed my old room, the sounds of my brother moving around next door, and even the creaks of the floorboards that I had come to know so well. I missed my parents despite everything that had happened. The hurt was still fresh, but there was a deep part of me that longed for the comfort and familiarity of my family. As the months went by, I made an effort to adjust, to make the best of the situation. My uncle and his wife were incredibly supportive, and they went out of their way to help me feel at home. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments when the homesickness hit hard, and I longed for the familiarity of my old life. But gradually I began to see the advantages of living with my uncle. One of the biggest differences was that, unlike my dad, my uncle didn't get angry with me over small things. He was patient and understanding, which made me feel less anxious and more at ease. Although my aunt was strict about making sure I did my homework every day, she also encouraged a healthy balance. She would let me hang out with my friends after school or play basketball, just like I used to before everything changed. It felt liberating to have that freedom again, to be able to enjoy the things I love without feeling guilty or pressured. My uncle and aunt also encouraged me to join various clubs at school and explore new hobbies. They saw potential in me, not just as a student, but as a person with interests and passions that went beyond academics. Their encouragement made a huge difference. I started to feel more confident and motivated, and with time my grades improved considerably. School no longer felt like a burden. It became something I genuinely enjoyed. The stress and pressure that had once consumed me were slowly being replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and excitement for the future. I would see my brother Michael every day at school, and we would hang out together like we always had. He would tell me about our parents, how they were doing, and what life was like at home. Sometimes I felt a pain of jealousy, especially when he talked about the little things they did together. But at the same time, I started to realize that I fit in more with my uncle and aunt. Their home was becoming my home, and the life I was building there felt right for me. Looking back, I realized that moving in with my uncle was one of the best things that could have happened to me. It was a turning point that helped me rediscover my passion for life and learning, and it gave me the chance to become the person I wanted to be, not just the person I was expected to be. When I graduated high school, it felt like a significant milestone, not just because I was closing a chapter in my life, but because I had worked hard and the effort paid off. I got accepted into my dream university with a partial scholarship. My uncle was particularly proud of me and generously offered to fund the remainder of my college fees, which was a huge relief. My aunt, always thoughtful and caring, even organized a small get-together to celebrate my achievements. It was a warm and intimate gathering with close family and friends. My parents attended the party. However, they did not seem particularly thrilled with my success. They didn't seem overly excited about my acceptance into college, and instead pointed out almost casually how in a few years, Michael might get into an even better university than I had. Hearing them say that was strange and unsettling. This was supposed to be a day to celebrate my achievements, a day where I could finally feel like I had made them proud. Yet instead of simply complimenting me and letting me enjoy the spotlight for one day, they seemed more focused on Michael's future potential than on my present success. What made it even more confusing was that I didn't see this as a competition. I would genuinely be happy if Michael got into a great university and achieved his own dreams. I loved him and wanted the best for him. But it was disheartening that my parents couldn't set aside their comparisons, even for this one day, to acknowledge my hard work and success, without reminding me that they loved my younger brother more. Throughout my time at university, my parents came to visit me only a handful of times. Each visit they visited, their conversation would inevitably shift to Michael. They talk about his accomplishments, his potential, and how proud they were of him. However, the situation took an unexpected turn when it came time for Michael to go to college. The reality of the situation was that he wasn't accepted into his first choice university and had to settle for a second choice. While his second choice was still a good university, it wasn't the prestigious institution my parents had been hoping for. They had been banking on his acceptance into the top university as a way to boast about their younger son being superior to the older one, me. With Michael's college placement not living up to their expectations, my parents found themselves in a difficult position. They could no longer use his achievements to compare or outshine mine, which seemed to leave them frustrated. The narrative they had carefully crafted of Michael being the academic star was disrupted. Now they couldn't brag about him any longer. Although I felt a sense of vindication, I also felt a pang of sympathy for Michael. Despite the way he was used as a benchmark, in my parents' eyes he was still my brother, and I knew that he must have tried his best to get accepted into the best. Over the years, my relationship with my parents remained strained, and eventually became almost non-existent. They rarely ever called me, and I stopped reaching out to them as well. After graduating from university, I landed a high-paying job across the country. I was a bit nervous about accepting, but my uncle and aunt encouraged me to give it a try. I am glad I took a chance and moved, as the opportunity allowed me to save a significant amount of money and make smart investments. 4 years ago, I was offered a senior managerial role at a major corporation. Thanks to my extensive experience, the salary boost has been more than sufficient for a luxurious lifestyle, and 2 years ago, I achieved one of my biggest dreams by purchasing my own home. While I haven't gotten married or had children yet, I've chosen to spend my money on myself and the things that make me happy. Meanwhile, I haven't forgotten about my uncle and aunt. I regularly keep in touch with them and make sure to send them birthday gifts and Christmas gifts each year as a token of my appreciation for everything they've done for me. I've also stayed connected with Michael, my younger brother, and continue to support him. Last year, Michael shared some troubling news with me. He had been laid off from his job at a tech company due to the economic downturn in the ongoing job crisis. Since then, he had been working on starting a business with a friend, but the venture wasn't progressing as smoothly as they had hoped. Given the challenges he was facing, he reached out to me for financial support, asking if I could invest in his business. Even though I didn't have detailed information about his business plan, I decided to invest in it blindly. My primary motivation was to show my support for Michael. I understood how tough the situation was for him and wanted to help him get back on his feet. I didn't even care if the business was going to fail, because all I wanted was to have my brother's back. Fortunately, his business has started performing well, and although it hasn't taken off yet, my brother is really grateful that I believed in him when no one else did this year. My family decided to host a grand birthday party for my grandma's 75th birthday. I was really looking forward to it, eager to reconnect with everyone after so many years. I flew down excitedly, ready to catch up with my family and celebrate the milestone. Over the years, I've changed a lot. My style, my appearance, and the way I spoke have all evolved, reflecting the comfortable and successful life I have built for myself. My parents, who hadn't seen me in 10 years, and hadn't even made any effort to stay in touch, were visibly shocked by the changes. My mom awkwardly greeted me with a warm hug, which was nice. My dad, on the other hand, seemed more reserved. He nonchalantly started asking questions about my job and position, and I could see the surprise in their eyes as I shared the details with him. I mentioned that I had even bought a house for myself, which took my dad by surprise. He immediately scoffed and expressed disbelief, implying that it wasn't possible for me to achieve such a huge thing. This pissed me off, so I told him that I would never lie about owning a house, and that not everyone is a loser who depended on his wife for financial support, like he had for all these years. This comment took my dad by surprise. However, before he could argue, I went on to add, growing up, your lack of faith in me was incredibly painful. It felt like no matter what I did, it was never good enough. I faced constant criticism and was always compared to Michael. However, I am not that little boy anymore. I am doing quite well for myself. Not that I have to prove it to you, but the fact that you can't recognize my achievements, even after all the things I have done, speaks more about your inability to see beyond your own insecurities than about me. It's clear that you still struggle with accepting my success. And frankly, that's your problem, not mine. My dad looked taken aback, since he clearly didn't expect me to push back. I also pointed out to him how I was the only one who had invested in his talented son's business, when Michael had no other prospects, so my dad needed to get his head out of the gutter and start respecting the person had become over the years. I knew my words were sharp and that they were likely to hurt. I saw the hurt in his face. However, a part of me felt justified in standing up for myself. Since he had always just dismissed me. Ever since the party, my mom has been calling me, expressing how deeply I hurt my dad with my comments. She has asked me to apologize to him for disrespecting him, since my words left him feeling embarrassed. She says I had no right to point out that he still depended on mom for money in turn. I have refused to back down and apologize to him, either for speaking the truth to my dad. Update 1. Just to clarify a few things. My dad never returned to work after his business failed. He attempted a few different things, but he didn't like working a regular 9-to-5 job. As a result, my mom has continued to support him financially, while he takes on the role of a house husband and does occasional freelance consulting work. Michael is aware of the strained relationship I have with our parents. He has never supported or participated in their favoritism. My brother genuinely loves me and has always tried to support me whenever he can. Back when our parents sent me to live with my uncle, Michael was still young and couldn't do much to help at the time. I think the main reason that my parents clearly disliked me is because I remind them about their failures. They clearly abandoned me when things got tough, hoping that by getting rid of me, all their problems would be gone, or at least that their lives would improve. However, they continued to face financial difficulties, while I thrived under my uncle's care. It must have felt like a slap in the face for them. Also, they never expected me to become successful in my life, so they just can't wrap their heads around it. My uncle and aunt never pressured my parents to take me back, as they were genuinely happy to have me with them. They consider me their son, though they never impose themselves on me, and allow me to shape our relationship on my own. Over the years, they've observed my parents' favoritism toward Michael, and I think that's why my aunt and uncle have been so fiercely protective and loving towards me. They provided me with everything that my parents could never give me. Update 2. I agree with a lot of y'all that I should not have to apologize to my dad when he was the one who had been rude to me. Hence, I decided to write an email to my parents, detailing how I felt about them all these years, and how disappointed I am that they never apologized. I wrote this email from the bottom of my heart, and recounted each and every incident that I remembered where they had failed me as parents. I told them how desperately I needed them as a child. Yet now I couldn't care less about their existence, since they had always abandoned me. After reading my email, I guess it must have opened their eyes to how deeply they had hurt me, because my mother called me, crying and apologizing for ever agreeing with my dad, and sending me to stay with my uncle. She explained that they had no other choice at the time, and confessed that seeing the pain in my eyes whenever we met afterward made her hate herself. She admitted that this guilt was one of the main reasons she had distanced herself over the years. I told her that her reasons no longer mattered to me because our relationship was beyond repair. I no longer considered her and dad as my parents. This deeply upset my mother, and she repeatedly asked me to let things go so we could start fresh. In the meantime, my dad hasn't made any effort to contact me, though my mom did mention that he was emotional after reading my email. I can only hope he feels at least some remorse for what he did to me years ago. For now, I have chosen to maintain distance from my parents, as I have always done in the past. Update 3. It's been a while since I updated here. Since sending that email to my parents, I felt a sense of relief and emotional release. It has been a cathartic experience, and I feel much lighter now, knowing that I finally spoke my mind to them. I've continued to maintain a relationship with my brother, regardless of my parents, and I will always support him as usual. Next month, I plan to take my uncle and aunt on a much-needed vacation to one of their dream destinations. My aunt has talked about this place for years, and I'm excited to surprise them with it.